Dr. Mehreen Faruqi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Madam Deputy President, I rise on behalf of the Greens as the spokesperson for Transport to make a contribution to this debate on the interim report of the Select Committee on the planning process in Newcastle and the broader Hunter. I thank the committee members for their work on this inquiry and in particular the work done by my Greens colleague Mr. David Shoebridge. I also thank the committee secretariat. This was a big inquiry with hundreds of submissions and the report is extensive and detailed. It came as no great surprise to anyone that the vast majority of interest in this inquiry, and indeed the lion's share of official submissions, were about the removal of the train services on Newcastle's rail line, the plan to truncate the line and install a couple of kilometres of light rail. The planning process around this decision was long-winded and in many ways farcical. On multiple occasions, we were given conflicting reports about preferred light rail routes and which ministers supported what. Even today, it is still unclear whether the government will end up with an initial route down Beresford Street or the existing rail corridor to the east of the planned Wickham interchange. Of course, the rail line was under threat for many years, from both Labour and coalition governments, before the cut actually happened on Boxing Day last year. And through that time, the community who relied on the rail were left hanging on a final decision. The interim report, published 8 days before the closure of the rail line, urged the government to hold off on the rail removal decision until a peer-reviewed report is obtained by the New South Wales government that thoroughly considers the economic, social and environmental costs and benefits of the alternative options of removing and retaining the existing rail line. This, Madam Deputy President, was ignored and services stopped. When I go to Newcastle and the Hunter these days to talk to people about the rail cut, the major questions they put to me basically boil down to this: why and for whom is the rail line being torn up? Well, it's certainly not for them. There isn't a shred of evidence that the changes in Newcastle will positively affect their way of life and their ability to commute and travel. This decision will only benefit those private developers who now will be given access to the rail corridor, which was previously used for the common good for getting people around in mass transit. In places like the inner city suburb of Cooks Hill, nowadays it's almost impossible to get a park, as workers who once caught the train into work are opting to drive into town. People around the Hunter who rely on public transport to get into Newcastle for work, for doctor's appointments or for recreation are being thoroughly inconvenienced and their lives are being made much harder. Others report that those from around the Lower Hunter and Central Coast who once came into Newcastle for shopping and recreation now go to Sydney instead, as the commute to Newcastle involves changing transport modes. People with disabilities, young families with prams and children, and travellers with luggage particularly feel the pain of having to change modes. Nowhere, Madam Deputy President, nowhere in the world but in New South Wales under this government would anyone rip up a perfectly good rail line connecting the hearts of two of the biggest cities, Sydney and Newcastle. Particularly as Newcastle and the Hunter continue to grow, we need to be making the commute faster between Sydney, the Central Coast and Newcastle to benefit and encourage commuters to actually revitalise these areas. This could be achieved through the introduction of tilt train technology and one day, ideally, high-speed rail. No one, not former Minister Berejiklian or current Minister Constance, has sought to provide a real justification about why the rail line needed to go. Indeed, in budget estimates last year, the then Transport Minister Berejiklian said the rail line removal was not a transport decision. While the government has made many contestable claims regarding the benefits or the so-called benefits of truncating the heavy rail line, perhaps the most dubious is that the substitution of this rail line by light rail will improve public transport patronage. We know that when people are forced to change modes of public transport, for no reason at all, they just move back into their cars and onto the road. I do wish to really thank the activists and campaigners in Newcastle and across the Hunter, including Greens members and the Save Our Rail group, for their ongoing pressure. At a community meeting in February, as well as the huge rally to save the rail in Newcastle at the end of last year, I met students, young mothers, and older Hunter residents who told me about how the rail was critical to how they got around. Labour came on board the campaign to save the Newcastle rail line late in the piece and only after a concerted community campaign. Sadly, it was too little too late. In June, the Greens exposed that the first usage figures for the rail replacement buses showed that the rail removal was crippling public transport use in Newcastle. The Minister reported in response to a question on notice that about 65,000 customer trips were taken on the rail replacement buses per month since the closure of the line. This indicates huge patronage losses when compared to the people who were boarding and alighting trains at Newcastle, Civic and Wickham before the removal of the line. This seems to indicate that the people are being forced back onto the road, meaning that congestion and pollution will get worse, and it is entirely the fault of the New South Wales government. In the 2015-2016 budget, which includes 103 million for ripping up the rail line and the imposition of a short stretch of light rail, think about the projects that 130 million could be spent on otherwise. This 103 million that could be a complete game changer for the failing bus network in Newcastle, bus network for which patronage and revenue has been falling for many years. 103 million would constitute a real start on making trains faster and more frequent in between the two biggest cities of our state. I echo the Reverend Fred Niles' queries as to whether the light rail will ever actually be built, and I have grave concerns for the future of transport in the Hunter. We are still waiting on the judgment on the court case initiated by Save Our Rail that will effectively determine whether the government will require an Act of Parliament to rip up the rail line. And I can guarantee you this, Madam Deputy President, that in the event of the government attempting to ram these changes through this Parliament, the Greens will fight tooth and nail to defeat the legislation. And I hope that alongside the opposition and other crossbenchers, we can stand up for rationality and sense. The final thing I will say is this. While the interim report of the inquiry was very strong and clear on the matter of the rail closure, the government's insistence that the removal go ahead has been unilateral and incredibly dismissive of the processes of democracy. Of all the poor planning and infrastructure decisions being made in New South Wales at the moment, this has to be one of the most nonsensical. We will continue to push for the full reinstatement of the rail line and an expansion, not a cannibalization, of public transport in Newcastle before it is too late. The residents of Newcastle, the Hunter, and indeed people across the state deserve nothing less than this.